y'all, welcome back. Today we are learning this entire week we are learning about nutrient cycles, and I'm going to explain what those are called, what those are in a little bit. But I wanted to give y'all our objective for the day. So today we are going to focus on two of these four cycles, and the two that we're going to focus on today are carbon and nitrogen cycles. I picked those to do earlier in the week. Normally I would do it in a different order. I would start with the water cycle first, then go into carbon and nitrogen, and eventually end with phosphorus. But these two are the harder ones, and I wanted to start with those so we have more time on Monday to come to office hours, ask questions before our quiz on Friday. So know that we're going to do a lot of the heavy lifting at the front of this week, and then the Thursday lesson will be very similar, and it'll be a little bit easier, and hopefully you'll grasp the concept by then. But our objective is to describe the flow of matter through the carbon and nitrogen cycles, and also to explain the consequences when these cycles don't work right, and when we disrupt those cycles. So as y'all know, I always start with my calendar. Today we are on the 27th, and then again, if you look on the 30th, we are going to be doing something very, very similar. And I will go into a little bit more detail on my next slide. So when you think of nutrient cycles, or they also are called biogeochemical cycles, I want you to think of that we have a limited amount of something, and it has to be recycled through our earth and on our biosphere. So if you think about the water cycle, water actually cycles through the environment through a circular path on earth. And we're going to talk about the water cycle more in depth on Thursday. But if you hopefully remember, when you were younger, you should have learned this in middle or even elementary school science. There is a certain amount of water that we have on earth, and it is recycled through the earth through these different things. So the water that was once raining is also the water that will one day end up in a cloud, and that water is also the water that will maybe one day end up in the ocean or be in a river. And so it's constantly recycled over time through our earth. Now, water is not the only thing that goes through these different cycles. There's also carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles, just to name a few, and those are the four that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. Today we are focusing on this carbon and nitrogen cycle. So we're going to start with our carbon cycle. If you did not know, there are a few elements that are really key to life on Earth and actually make up most living things. And just to name a few, one of them is carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and also sulfur. And so all of these are going to be things that take place in these cycles that we are going to talk about. So again, the first one that we're starting with is our carbon cycle. In case you did not know or you were unaware, carbon is actually the building block of life. Carbon is an essential element in the bodies of living things. And so it's actually, humans are actually made of carbon, and most other animals. Humans are actually 18% carbon by weight, which is just kind of a cool fact. But it's also economically important to modern humans because carbon also is in a different form of fossil fuels that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And what's unique about carbon is that it actually moves through living things. And so the carbon cycle moves from the atmosphere. When we talk about the atmosphere, that word atmosphere, I want you to think of air. Okay, it's just the air. It's what makes up our hydrosphere around us. And it moves actually through food webs, so through organisms, through living things, and back to the atmosphere. The way that it is actually emitted back into the atmosphere is through the burning of those fossil fuels. And if you don't remember what fossil fuels are, I will write them right here. But it's things like coal, oil, and natural gas. So actually every single day when you used to get in the car and drive to school, or when your parents drove to work, or maybe they got on a bus to work, or maybe you got on a bus to school, our cars were actually burning natural gas and emitting carbon back into the atmosphere every single day. And this buildup of fossil fuels, we're gonna talk about its impact in a little bit. But that is how carbon might be released back into the atmosphere. Some carbon is also stored for long periods of time and areas called carbon sinks. So we're going to kind of look at this cycle. All of these cycles are depicted in pictures that kind of help understand the different processes that each of them go through. And actually, oftentimes the carbon cycle is most easily studied as two different subcycles. One dealing with the exchange among living organisms, and one dealing with a longer term cycling of carbon through geologic processes. So I'm going to break that down. Now, when we're thinking about carbon, I want y'all to understand that there is a finite amount of carbon on Earth. There's always been the same amount of carbon. And carbon, again, is essential to almost all things on life. When we talk about glucose, which are sugars that our body needs in the form of food, when we talk about ATP, adenosine triphosphate, how our body uses energy, amino acids, DNA, they all have carbon as an essential element in them. Even CO2 that we breathe in, that has carbon in it. So there's always carbon since the beginning of Earth, and it's basically recycled through this process. So the way that I like to start talking about the carbon cycle is carbon dioxide is in our air, and it actually looks like this molecule where there's 2 carbons and 1 oxygen. Sorry, that's 1 carbon, 2 oxygen, CO2. So this middle thing might be our carbon. And there's a ton of carbon dioxide in our air. Now, when we think about plants don't grow from nothing at all. They have to grow from, I think in 7th grade y'all learned about energy, nothing can be created or destroyed. No matter can be created or destroyed. Well, a tree is matter, and it can't just be created from nothing. So what actually ends up happening is it starts to grow and it starts to build by taking not only CO2 from the air, but there also might be carbon in the soil, and it will start growing into whatever it is. Now, over time, other organisms, let's say a bunny, can't really draw a bunny, it wants to go eat that plant. Now, when it eats that plant, it's also going to consume that carbon. And that carbon will then eventually be released back into the air through respiration, which is this thing that we have over here. So as carbons grow and use carbon, as plants grow and use carbon to grow, they also will transfer that carbon back into the air through respiration. Now, decomposers also release organic compounds and carbon dioxide when they break down dead organisms and waste products, which we have right here, the decomposition of organisms. Carbon can quickly cycle through this biological pathway, especially in an aquatic ecosystem. And overall, 1,000 to 100,000 million metric tons of carbon move through biological pathways each year. We also talked about this second pathway, this longer one of cycling carbon through geologic processes. Now, a geologic pathway of carbon takes much longer than the biological pathway that we described. It actually will take millions of years for carbon to cycle through the geological pathway. And if you don't remember that geological has to do with rocks and sediments. And so if you've ever heard that fossil fuels take millions of years to form and that we are running out, that's what they're talking about. Carbon actually can be stored for long periods of time in the atmosphere, bodies of liquid water, mostly in the ocean. Sometimes they're in the ocean. Ocean sediment, soil, rocks, fossil fuels, and the Earth's interior. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of this geological process because it involves a lot of different reactions, and we haven't taken chemistry yet, so we don't fully understand these reactions. But basically, when organisms die, their remains may sink and eventually become part of the sediment on the ocean floor. And over time, the sediment will turn into limestone, which is the largest carbon reservoir on Earth. On land, carbon can be stored in soil as organic carbon from decomposition of living organisms as organisms die and are buried in the soil. And deep underground are fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and natural gas, which are the remains of actually plants that have decomposed under specific conditions where there's not oxygen. And we call those conditions anaerobic. So deep underground, if decomposing organisms get buried deep enough and they do not have oxygen, so I'm going to write no O2, they will actually have enough pressure and have the correct environment to turn into fossil fuels. Now, again, it takes millions and millions of years for that to happen. So when humans burn them, carbon actually can be released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And that process is called combustion, which I have just circled on your screen. Okay, so we do need to know these main terms of combustion and respiration. So combustion is the burning of fossil fuels. It releases carbon back into the atmosphere. And respiration is when animals, plants, or any living thing can essentially exchange and breathe out carbon into the atmosphere. We also want to know that fossil fuels form under conditions where there is no oxygen. Now, I know that was a lot of information, so if you need to pause the video and take a quick brain break, I will post a link to another video explaining the carbon cycle if you need someone besides me to explain it to you. Maybe my way of explaining it was confusing, or you can come to office hours and I can explain it a different way. But if you had your brain break and you've walked around and you are ready to go on to the next cycle and the last one we're going to talk about today is our nitrogen cycle. Again, nitrogen is a major component that make up most living things. And nitrogen cycle mostly takes place underground. Now, if you go back to this carbon cycle took place pretty much everywhere in living things and non-living things and rocks in the ocean, whereas this nitrogen cycle is mainly going to take place underground. Nitrogen and its gas form is unstable for living organisms. So nitrogen can't just be in our atmosphere and us just grab nitrogen out of the atmosphere and be able to use it. Now, we need nitrogen in our bodies. We need to be able to use it, but we cannot get it from the atmosphere. Unlike carbon, we can actually get carbon from the atmosphere. It's in carbon dioxide and it's in our air. Plants take in carbon dioxide and they use that to grow. And they actually break that molecule down and can grow and develop and use that form from the atmosphere. But that's not the same for nitrogen. Now, plants do need nitrogen, but they don't get it from the air. They actually get it from soil. Okay, so I have this kind of picture. We have actually a lot of nitrogen in our air, but it's in this form of N2. And that just means that there are basically 2 nitrogen atoms that are stuck together. Now, when plants want to use it, they don't want them stuck together, so something has to come in and cut them in half. Okay, and we call that fixing. We've got to fix the nitrogen so that we can be able to use it. So what ends up happening is nitrogen is actually absorbed and fixed into a different form in the soil that it can be absorbed by living things. And that form that we fix it into is called ammonium or ammonia. And you'll see that in our cycle picture in the next slide. Lightning, which is kind of interesting, also fixes nitrogen gas into ammonia due to a huge amount of energy that can kind of come down and essentially break this molecule. But again, lightning only happens in specific conditions, so we can't rely on lightning alone to break this into molecule apart into ammonia. And ammonia is NH4, which just means it is a nitrogen molecule that's attached to 4 hydrogens around it. So we don't want 2 nitrogens next to each other. We need it to be in this form over here. I'm not going to ask you any questions about the chemical structure of it. I just kind of wanted to let you know, basically in our air, nitrogen is 2 molecules together, and we need it to get into that form over there. So the next slide is going to have my cycle on it. And so hopefully my nitrogen cycle popped up for you as well. So in my cycle, I'm going to start in the atmosphere. So nitrogen is everywhere. In fact, nitrogen in this N2 form that we have right over here actually makes up 78% of the atmosphere. So that means 78% of the air that we are breathing is actually nitrogen. And that's really unfortunate because we can't use that form of nitrogen. We've got to break it down into some way that our bodies can use it. And that actually surpasses the amount of oxygen that we think of as air. So most of the air that's around us is actually nitrogen. Now, again, like I kind of mentioned in the previous slide, nitrogen exists as N2 gas. And living things cannot use that. So we've actually got to do this thing called nitrogen fixing. Okay, that's a term that we do need to know. Nitrogen fixing. And when we're fixing it, we're turning that into ammonia. So that's actually what's happening. And that is a form of nitrogen that's usable by plants. So when animals eat plants, they are able to acquire nitrogen compounds, and we're going to talk about how it's going to be able to be cycled. Now, the thing that actually fixes our nitrogen, like we've been talking about, is single-celled prokaryotes. And if you remember anything about single-celled prokaryotes, hopefully you remember that most of those are bacteria. Okay, so bacteria are actually the main thing that's going to fix this nitrogen into a form that we need to be able to use it right. So bacteria are extremely important in soil because without those, this nitrogen wouldn't be able to be recycled through our plants, through us, back into the soil, back into the atmosphere. Now we kind of have two sets of bacteria here. We have bacteria that's fixing our nitrogen right here, that's turning NO2 into ammonia. And then we also have nitrifying bacteria that's turning that ammonia into nitrites and nitrates. Now, I'm not going to ask you specifics, but basically you need to know that bacteria are converting atmospheric nitrogen into a fixable form of nitrogen that can be taken up by plants. So eventually this nitrogen will transfer to any sort of plant. Now, the nitrogen-containing molecules are passed to animals, aka humans and other living things, when plants are eaten. So if you are hungry and you go eat a big salad, you're most likely consuming some nitrogen that was fixed by bacteria in the soil. They may be incorporated into the animal's body or broken down and excreted as waste, such as urea found in urine. And eventually it will all be cycled back. Now, nitrogen doesn't remain forever in the bodies of living organisms. Instead, it's converted from organic nitrogen back into that N2 gas by bacteria. So inside humans' bodies, we have denitrifying prokaryotes, again, more bacteria, that turn those nitrates and nitrites that we had back into N2. So eventually there'll be more bacteria either inside our bodies or inside plants that are going to convert those nitrogen molecules back into O2, and it will be released from humans or other living things in a process that involves several steps that we're not going to get into an extreme details, but most likely nitrogenous compounds from dead organisms and waste are going to be given back into the soil. The process starts all over again, and again we have this recycling, reusing of nitrogen. Now, I did not want to forget this, so I put a little slide in here. Our exit ticket password is bacteria because they are the most important thing in this nitrogen cycle. They fix into ammonia. They can turn ammonia into nitrates, and eventually they will turn nitrates back into that N2, so it's constantly just a giant circle. So bacteria is your exit ticket password. Really quickly, I wanted to kind of fly through this slide. I don't have a lot more to talk about, but natural and human activities can actually disrupt these carbon and nitrogen cycles, and we're going to talk about this next week a little bit more in depth, but I have a picture here that just kind of shows you a couple things. Volcanic eruptions add carbon, nitrogen, and other chemicals into the atmosphere. Forest fires release carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus and sulfur sequestered in the biomass that make up trees, and they release it back into the atmosphere. Landslides, earthquakes can alter the land and change the course of rivers, burying or releasing carbon, nitrogen, and other chemicals, disrupting cycles. And living plants and animals sequestered carbon, nitrogen, and other chemicals in their bodies, which keeps these chemicals out of the cycle until the organisms die. So we humans actually can play a role in each of these different things. So we do call these disruptions. And hopefully all of us have heard of global warming, which has been recently changed to this term called climate change. The world is not just warming. The extremes at both ends, being too cold or being extremely hot, they're getting wider extremes, and it's because of a couple things. The burning of fossil fuels and poor farming practices release huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, leading to a lack of balance in the carbon cycle. And that has actually broken down the Earth's ozone layer. More carbon in the atmosphere, I want you to think of it as like a blanket over the Earth. So if you have a blanket over the Earth, obviously you're going to have an increase in atmosphere temperatures. And if temperatures are going to increase, you're going to have an increase in ocean temperatures. And ocean holds less carbon, and that means more carbon in the atmosphere, which is a bad thing. And we actually just recently had Earth Day last week. If y'all did not know or did not see Instagram posts, but since we've celebrated Earth Day in 1970, the Earth has warmed 2.7 degrees higher since 1970. And that might not seem like a lot, but if you think about it in terms of your body likes to be at 98.5 degrees. If you add and tell your body, oh, we don't want you to be at 98.5 degrees anymore, we want you to be at 98.5 plus 2.7 degrees, let's figure out what that is. That's actually going to be 101.2. If you have a degree of 101.2, what do you have? If you said fever, hopefully you knew that. You have a fever, and that means you're sick. Okay? Our Earth has risen 2.7 degrees since 1970. That is never a good thing, and it's not a good thing. And probably the only positive from coronavirus is that we are seeing a decrease of carbon being released into the atmosphere. And that is probably one of the only positive things I can think of from coronavirus, is that it's actually impacting our environment and our Earth pretty positively. If you would love to talk about this more, I have an article for y'all to read, or we can just come and talk about it at office hours. That is all I had for today. You do have an exit ticket. The exit ticket password was given in the video earlier. If you skip to the end, go back and watch the video. It's somewhere in there. But you do have an exit ticket, and it's just going to be over carbon and nitrogen cycles. There is a worksheet or an assignment. That assignment is over the most important cycles. So it's going to be over carbon, nitrogen, and water cycles. It's not due until Friday. Okay, so you actually can work at that at your own pace. It's a Google Doc. You're going to submit it when you're done. But you can work it at your own pace. If you come to office hours, we will do this in office hours. If you need help, you just have to ask me, and I will walk you through that worksheet. Office hours, we're going to do a walkthrough of your assignment if you need help. And the last thing is you're going to have a lesson on Thursday, but don't forget, this is all going to be on your quiz on Friday and on your final. But you still have another quiz. Please come to office hours, and I will help y'all through any of this. It's really hard for me to meet with people outside of those office hours. So if you come for office hours, that's the best time for me to help you. But please continue to reach out if I can do anything else for you. Okay, have a great day.